My name is Aydeen, and I'm a research assistant with the Ministry of Education in the Labor Relations Division. I have no information about union payouts. Sorry, I can't help you. The Community Hubs Advisory Group was appointed by the provincial government, and it has announced its recommendations. In this session, you will learn more about the research on schools as community hubs and engage in discussion on possible challenges and solutions as the recommendations are implemented. We have two panelists speaking today. Diane Dyson has been active in education for 20 years and on the steering committee for People for Education and the Toronto Parent Network, chairing the TDSP's Community Equity Advisory and Intercity Advisory Committees. She has authored reports on community hubs for the Intergovernmental Committee on Economic and Labour Force Development in Toronto, and most recently an appendix in the Pitre report on the evidence case for community hubs. Diane is currently Director of Research and Public Policy at WoodGreen Community Services in Toronto, where she also supported the work of CAFE. Diane tweets at Diane_Dyson, that's D-Y-S-O-N, and blogs at belongingcommunity.wordpress.com. Karen Pitre has been appointed Special Advisor to the Premier on Community Hubs. She has extensive stakeholder consultation, strategic planning, and project management experience. Her experience includes working at Metrolinx as the Consulting Executive Director of Electrification, a complex project involving stakeholder consultations developed with the input from a community advisory committee. Karen is also a steering committee member of Community Assets for Everyone, which formed in the spring of 2013. With the vision of creating the appropriate legislative, political, and infrastructure environments to establish Ontario's schools as hubs to support and strengthen the health of Ontario communities. Karen has also worked with the TDSB's Toronto Lands Corporation, where she developed a framework of stewardship of surplus capital assets. In this role, she managed consultations with key stakeholders, including the Ministry of Education, Toronto District School Board trustees and staff, as well as community groups. Now, welcome. And I'm going to pass it on to our two panelists, and then we're going to follow with a Q&A and discussion session.
I don't know if we need this. So thank you very much for that. Diane and I are doing a tag team, which we've done for a while now. So it feels quite comfortable. So I apologize to those of you who've heard this before. I think we've gone through this presentation a few times. But I think it's important to sort of put a bit of context on this. And then what we'd really like to do today is get your advice and your feedback, because we've got a very ambitious implementation plan. And I always tell people that we've actually made some pretty bold recommendations. It doesn't mean we necessarily know how best to actually get those done. So we talk about moving the mothership and putting the ball up the hill and all those analogies. That's what we're now focused on. So just by way of, let me just see here. By way of background, so last March, the Friday of March break, as a matter of fact, the Premier appointed me as the Special Advisor of Community Hubs. And I thought this would actually be a very low-key Friday March break kind of announcement, and I found that people could find me from anywhere. And over the course of the weekend, was completely bombarded with emails. And what was really interesting was the diverse sectors that actually reached out immediately with 20 years of pent-up enthusiasm to talk about this topic. And it was from community health, legal aid, schools, education, libraries, you name it. Everybody had something to say about community hubs, which was great. We also put together an advisory group, and at the beginning we actually have 9 members of the advisory group, and we did not put stakeholders on the advisory group for a reason, because actually the stakeholders would have filled the entire stadium in terms of people that had an interest. From the education sector alone, we could have filled an advisory group. So we actually had a number of people, of which Annie Kidder was one, who had experience and history working on a number of these. So we had people from the corporate community, we had education, but none of them were actual stakeholder vested interest, which in hindsight, we didn't really realize how broad this was going to be. It actually turned out to be really well, because our biggest challenge was actually trying to frame the conversation, because it was so big. And how do we actually, do this in a manageable way that we can actually move forward? Other thing we did was we reached out to WoodGreen, who had been part of the conversation on community hubs for a long time, and Diane's going to speak to a little bit about the work that they did as part of this. But when the Premier tasked me with this and the advisory group, she made it very clear. She said, I don't want to go back into the history of why this is a good idea. I don't want to go back and sort of belabor this issue. We all know it's a good idea. So how do we figure out how to move this forward in a more seamless way, which was a really interesting, different approach. She originally said, can you put this together, since we've been talking about it for 20 years, in 90 days? No, she said 30 days to start, and we ended up with 90 days, which was, again, a bit of a crazy time. But I think in some ways she was right, because there was so much good information and a lot of good work that had already been done. We didn't have to go back and start that over. The last part, which was really important to the 90 days and actually continuing onward, is that we actually have a secretariat, a community hub secretariat, if you can believe it, in Cabinet Office that actually is trying to now sort of work within government across all the ministries, which is a pretty daunting challenge. But as you probably know, there were 6 mandate letters provided to different ministers, which included community hubs. So that was, the Ministry of Health, Education, Community and Social Services, Municipal Affairs. And all of those ministries had their heads down, and they were working away on their community hubs like good civil servants do. And it wasn't until we actually brought it up to a higher level that they could actually come out of their ministries and talk to the people that were working across ministries. And that was because of the work at Cabinet Office. So it's been an interesting journey so far. But we also knew that while we didn't want to go back and, justify why community hubs were important, we also didn't want to go back and reinvent the wheel. So we actually asked WoodGreen to help us sort of go through a bit of a history on this. And I'm going to just ask Diane to give a little overview in terms of the work that they did as part of this.
So I was really glad to have been able to join in on this, and part of it was because we had worked earlier on CAFE, and many of you actually were there and or found us through our website. And CAFE was the same sort of conversation where a group of us said, we know why we should be doing this, we know who should be doing this, we know what should be done, but it's the how, and how do we get people to buy in. So that was the early conversation, and we were so pleased when provincial government responded and gave the go-ahead to have these conversations. And so Karen actually has a bad schedule. She's talking to parties everywhere about the how, and so that's what we hope to get to today. But I will give you sort of because I'm a researcher, I will give you a couple of the slides about what do we know about community hubs. And community hubs are popping up across the world really strongly in the British Commonwealth. So we see them, my favorite example from England is the pubs in hubs, hubs in pubs. You wouldn't know it, but the local pubs face a steep decline. People have realized that they might not want to spend all their evenings in dark corners. So the pub owners have linked up with Prince Charles, who has helped launch this new way that you can, in every village at least there is that, and you can come and get some of the information services you need. I was telling Karen about an example out of Melbourne. The Greater Dunedin Council has now come out with a community hub framework. It's much briefer, and I think they read ours. But this conversation about the wisdom of community hubs is there everywhere. Even the great Jane Jacobs had a quick reference to community hubs as an idea when she talked about the importance of them being always located at crossroads where people gather. And so those ideas are long embedded. So I don't think I need to convince people about the wisdom of this, but I'll give you sort of the quick run-through. When I did the research for the ICE committee looking at mapping what are the different hub initiatives across Toronto, we knew that the school board was talking about community use of schools. We knew that United Way had stepped forward with the provincial government Ministry of Health to develop different hubs and such. What we didn't know was all the different grassroots efforts that were also going on. So we started off with an estimation that we would see about 20 hub initiatives across the city and ended up with twice that. And had a chance to interview people that were operating them in all different fields, from the arts field to to places like WoodGreen, which as a neighborhood center, originally a settlement house, though has a long historic tradition of recognizing that if you're going to make a change in a community, you need to do it locally, where people can access services and where they can create communities together. In fact, the way I sum that up is that community hubs work because of the 3 S's. There's the services that are offered there, that's the obvious part. And luckily, in welcoming government into this conversation, we're talking about government services as well as community services. The magic of space, just having a place where people can gather. Shopping malls have become sort of our other version. One of my friends reminded me of where we just gather and wander about. But at least that community hub, it won't cost you. Your credit card will suffer less. And then there's the magic ingredient of community hubs, which is synchronicity. And it is that bridging of having young people gathering in space close to where the older folks are down the hallway, or perhaps in the same sorts of activities because they all have a common interest in an art or project or a social justice project, things like that. That synchronicity that emerges out is also part of the magic of what a community hub does. There is no single definition for what a hub is, although an early media interview with Karen, I think, captured it when she said, well, a hub is what's needed locally. And so it allows, again, that definition to arise from each individual community, recognizing, though, that by creating space and bringing in what people need, you end up with the synchronicity, the magic of it. Just imagine having, there's a conversation I'm having with some folks in the beach here in Toronto that are talking about a school space where they really want to be able to put their kindergarten kids on the ground floor and have housing for seniors up above. And they can all use the same cafeteria. There's just a magic to some of these ideas that get put forward. And what's also important, and what we know through WoodGreen, for instance, is the wraparound that's so important. So one of our most successful programs provides housing for young mums, has childcare on the ground floor so that everything is within easy access. Those are some of the magic that comes from it. Libraries are also good examples of places that have become community gathering places where people go not just now to pick up a book, but to access the internet, to join a quilting club. One of my neighbors just recently told me about all other sorts of things like that. A lot of this is feel-good stuff, and in our conversations with Karen, she was like, okay, but I have to be able to convince bureaucrats. I need to be able to convince the business community. What are some of the other harder outcomes that come out of that? So what I was also able to gather, and you'll see that in the appendix of the report, is the social return on investment, and we'll give you 2 examples of that, where we see in the fact that while in the short term, you may actually, and United Way found this to their dismay, that sometimes a hub costs more to operate simply because the demand rises when people know where to get services, or because there's a demand to operate outside the 9-to-5 framework that many of us do, that be open on weekends, to be open in the evenings. However, the longer-term payoffs are well worth it. So 2 quick examples, and spacebar. Good.
Much easier.
She said, so give me a list of where this is happening across the province then. And 2 of the 2 quick examples that I want to show you there, but I wanted to actually say part of the first challenge of that is actually nobody tracks this. So how we did it was through Google searches and Boolean terms and all sorts of places. And so if you were excluded, our apologies for that. Maybe it's simply because you didn't have a web page. But we were able to track down between 40 and 60 different initiatives across the province. 2 of the fun examples, one at the forefront, Lang's is the community health centre that is over in Cambridge. Cambridge also having several neighbourhood centres in that small community already. They have built a new building with a walking track along the top so that people are getting their exercise, and there's several different services there that can go to it. Karen might jump in because she's actually been there, I think.
Not to Lang's.
You didn't go to Lang's?
No.
Okay.
Everyone else did.
The whole advisory board had a trip to there. And the second one, which is worth pointing out, is the Fusion Youth Centre in Ingersoll, where it was an old that was taken over by the municipality. And what happened when they began to track what was the impact of this, they found a decrease in calls to 911, decrease in youth crime. They found a decrease in emergency room visits. And those things kind of make sense to those of us who work with students, because the window where most youth crime happens is from 3 to 6, when the parents are still at work, school is finished, and suddenly young people had something that would occupy them. So I'm going to throw it back to Karen, because now we should talk about the vision going forward.
So thanks. I wanted to also mention, just because it's very top of mind for me, last night I was actually invited to a screening of a movie by Sheldon Kennedy called Swift Current. And I have to tell you, it's still hardly recovered from it. It's pretty emotional, pretty powerful. But we spent a day together, actually, because KPMG is doing a lot of work on the social return on investment, and they are working with Sheldon, who's working at a family, it's the Sheldon Kennedy Children and Family Services in Alberta. And it's a really powerful story, needless to say. For those of you who don't know, the hockey player who actually came out against his coach and ended up having his coach jailed. But the interesting thing, he said nobody was connecting the dots. So, you know, he had depression, he had mental health issues, he ended up with addiction problems, he had all kinds of, and nobody ever asked him why. And then there were privacy reasons why nobody could actually talk to each other, and so he just went into a spiral. And it was sort of a document of his life. And it was also, he was speaking at a forum, and two actually young children, not young children, young adults came out and said that this was their story as well. The reason I use this is he has actually changed a lot of the thinking in Alberta. They've actually changed the privacy legislation so they can actually work on this. But more importantly, at the center itself, which is a single-focus community hub, but it also brings together a much more integrated services so that actually people look at the child, they come in, there's one intake, they actually don't have to explain this story to 18 different people, they do it once. And going back to Diane's point about the social return on investment, is they found that they get a 60% guilty plea, so they don't have to put the child in court. The adult, the perpetrator, is actually put in jail, and they save all the court costs along the way. It's just and he's working. The reason he was here and he was meeting with a lot of government officials was trying to figure out how you do that integrated service delivery. So it was really powerful, and he's doing amazing work. But boy, what a journey! I tell you, it's very powerful.
Huge potential.
Anyways, so that's just another example of sort of a single purpose. But we wanted to give you a bit of an idea of sort of what we went through. So we broke down the report in terms of the journey so far, what we heard, and we put together a bit of a framework and an action plan. And this is it. And I have to say that probably most of you probably haven't read it, but it's only 39 pages. The action plan's like 3 pages. So it's actually an easy read, and part of our challenge was trying to write it in a way that it was not your typical government report. Nearly killed us, but we did it. And that was a challenge in and of itself, because through this exercise, in terms of the journey so far, it was so powerful. And I have done so many consultations, and I was completely blown away by the interest and the quality of the people that actually participated in this. So we actually set up a website through Cabinet Office. We put together an online survey. We heard from about 350 organizations, and I would say that the submissions that they provided, clearly there was just, they'd been waiting for this opportunity, but we asked them, we were very clear, and we said, we know there's barriers, we know there's problems, we get that, so highlight those, but then more importantly, tell us what you would do to fix them, because we really don't know the answers, and the Premier and the province were actually very interested in saying, there's lots of challenges, but unless we actually have a roadmap for how we're going to do this, it just is completely overwhelming. We also met with about 70 different stakeholder groups. We tried to plug gaps, frankly, where people who hadn't come to us or were grumpy that they weren't on the advisory committee. That's another. Yeah, we try to hit those as well. But it was just a really interesting, crazy kind of journey where we actually went forward. I'll come back in a minute if you don't mind. We'll get through this, and then we have a session set up. But what we heard, and we sort of outlined 3 major themes, and I sort of highlight the positive. We heard that there are amazing things happening, and I would say there are amazing things happening on the ground through local heroes, through people that have been putting together these amazing success stories despite incredible challenges. We heard there was actually some amazing work going on in government to try and tackle some of the issues that were brought forward, but they were all continuing to work on that. We then tried to identify them into 3 themes that we kept hearing again and again, and I call it uncoordinated planning, no client-focused service delivery, actually the public property and community infrastructure that's all falling apart. So we tried to sort of figure out, okay, so how do we do that? And you'll see the words that came up again and again and again. And, you know, we just tried to sort of summarize the frustration that it had been building. It's uncoordinated. We're working in silos. There's huge disincentives, all of those things.
We're moving so quickly that we even, you'll see number 2 is not there, but we mean
yeah.
It's always evolving and changing.
You know, I don't know how long that's been like that. You're the first person who said that, so thank you. So what we did was we actually, the Premier gave us the vision. What she wanted to see out of this is we wanted to be the best place to work, live, and raise a family, and community hubs are very much a part of that vision. And I have to say that having the Premier say this, I can't tell you how much it actually captures the interest in the government, which I have, it's quite remarkable. And the fact that she has been the Minister of Education, she has been the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Transportation, and she had this vision all along, and she couldn't actually move this file forward. So now as the Premier, I think she's saying, okay, now is the time that we can actually do this. And we tried to outline from what we heard the principles, and I think what we heard again is, and clearly I call it the one-stop shopping, which is me at the province, there is a need for provincial leadership. And there's a need actually for a broader provincial leadership than just call Karen, because that's becoming a little bit daunting. But the other one that's really important is that community planning needs to be done locally with strong local leadership. And we were very clear to say we're trying to define the roles. Our role is not trying to figure out what needs to be done locally. And I do use a couple of examples where people would call and say, you know, what is a community hub? What's in a community hub? Because we want one. And I said, well, actually, no, you need to figure out what you need on the ground, and we're not trying to determine what that looks like. But the last one also was really important, was community hubs are built through collaboration and shared responsibility. And in some ways, this is the hardest one, because actually collaboration and shared responsibility is really hard and takes a lot of time, and the actual turfs and the built-up animosity over decades is really challenging to overcome. So we're trying to actually change behavior, change people's psyche in terms of how they do things differently, which is tough. I can say just in the last few months, it's very tough. But we put together the goals to try and tackle some of those. And then we laid out a number of recommendations, and we tried to put them together in 7 key areas. The most important one, really, though, is the foundational recommendation, which is there needs to be some sort of coordination across government, which is not just Cabinet Office, which is not just Karen, which is not just the advisory group, which actually changes the way government makes decisions. So there is leadership. The Premier is very keen, the Secretary of Cabinet. There's actually a Deputy Minister's Implementation Committee. There's very strong leadership, but the process is not set up to actually do this kind of work in government. We haven't solved that one. But that's very much on our list of things that need to happen. And it's not just community hubs. And the one thing I would say, which was really quite interesting, is partway through this process, I actually spoke to the Premier and I said, you know, it seems kind of bizarre to me that we're talking about community hubs as changing the way government does business. But that's sort of what we're talking about. And she said, go for it, because it actually is the way people experience the provincial government on the ground in either a positive or a negative way. A lot of times it's negative, but there's a way to actually try and understand that. So we broke it down into 7 areas where we were trying to do integrated service delivery, which was the example I gave you in Alberta. Developing a public strategy for public properties. This is one that's just about killing me, but we're going to fix it. But it's interesting because, like everything in government, it's done in various ministries. So education has the schools, health has the hospitals and the community health centres. We have Infrastructure Ontario that has all of the main portfolio of the government. But we don't actually ever look at them together. We don't look at them as what's surplus. If we have, property or space that's surplus, should we be actually aligning that within the government? We need long-term care in Toronto, but we're selling off schools. Maybe we should actually figure that out before we sell them. I'm sure that resonates with this group. But that is, so getting that actual database in one place is really interesting, I have to say.
Use Google.
Well, yeah. And then changing the way that actually that capital is planned, so that before we actually have a conversation about that, we actually understand as a provincial government what we're looking for. So that actually is hard. And it's not to say that it's, I would say that's number one, sort of trying to figure that out. Lots of these are hard, but that one should be solvable in the world in which we work in database and GIS and Google. We're going to fix this at some point. The third one is removing barriers and incentives. Actually identified ones that people had brought forward to us. I felt this enormous responsibility to actually take all the amazing work that people had done and play it back. We heard a lot of the barriers. We actually heard that there are very few incentives. In fact, there's many disincentives for actually working together that are pushing people apart as opposed to pulling them together. We also said that in 90 days we found some of them, we heard some of them, but we didn't figure them all out. So as we're going through this implementation, we're going to find more, and we want to try and understand as we work through this what those look like. Support integrated and long-term local planning, and it's just so interesting, kind of depressing. If you look at even the geographical boundaries that people are planning in, so you put a school board, actually 4 school boards, the municipality, the regional municipality, the LINs, the service agencies, and no boundaries align. So we talked to a community in Parry Sound, and it was just mind-boggling. They could have gone to 123 different planning tables if they actually were trying to deliver all the services in a way. We decided we were not going to recast all the geographical boundaries, but we are actually working with municipal affairs of saying, how do we actually plan, and who leads, and how does this work so that we can actually have a much more integrated local planning. And we're also having the conversation is how do you do that at the province. So again, not easy, but certainly everybody recognized that, you know, the LIN, which is the healthcare, they're looking at all of their needs, and everyone else is looking at their needs, and those two bodies where there is a really great examples of some communities that do it really well. And I look at Hamilton, they showed us what they were doing. They're doing really interesting work, and they have quarterly meetings with the CEOs of the hospital, the universities, the colleges, the school boards. They all sit down, they look at it collectively, and they work on strategies that actually are good for everybody. So they're doing it. Because they've decided it's important, but it's not something that is done across the board. So we're trying to figure out how we would do that in a more systemic way. Financially sustainable community hubs has come up again and again and again, and Diane mentioned it briefly where we talk about, you know, you set up a hub and then everybody wants the services and things boom, and we actually have to figure out how we make them more financially viable. So we've got a number of tools that we're looking at. We're looking at different partnership opportunities. You know, how do we actually make this, again, easier for people on the ground to make them more sustainable?
I didn't tell you, but I got a high five from some staff at United Way because they're really happy how Ministry of Health is working on community hubs with them. Thank you.
And that was, you know, it's interesting. So one of the recommendations we heard from the health sector, heard from the health sector from every community health center in the province about the Ministry of Health and their capital approval process, and you're trying to build a hospital in a community health center, which is completely ridiculous. I would say the good thing is that the Ministry of Health had heard that, so they were trying to revise the guidelines at the same time this came out. So we gave each a lift, and we now have draft guidelines policies that we've been working with the Community Health Center. We got unlocked the money that was for the Rexdale Community Health Center, which for 8 years was stuck in the Ministry of Health and has been built and empty for, you know, how many years?
Yeah, the Rexdale Community Hub is a former school that has multiple services in it, but it had this 1,000 square feet of waiting for CHC to step up. Yeah.
Anyway, so those little irritants actually in some ways are what we call the low-hanging fruit, because we were able to actually move those even during the period of time and actually really shining a light on some of the challenges. So those ones we've actually been able to really move that forward. Increasing local capacity is a really big one. I mean, we've got, again, amazing people that have done this on the ground with actually none of the skill sets. So poor social worker / agency worker now becomes project manager, developer, partnership agreement developer, like, you know, completely outside of what they really want to be doing or actually have the skill set to do. So we're trying to look at, okay, so how do we actually add that resource or help them do it if they want to do it, or add more capacity to make it a little bit easier. And then last but not least, we said we really want to evaluate and monitor the outcomes. So right now the way many programs work is just how many people are you actually putting through a program, as opposed to, are you actually making a difference, and are those outcomes actually keeping them out of the program? And how do we actually evaluate community hubs? So if this is something that we're going to really do on a broader scale, how do we actually compare or modify things that are not working to make sure that we put in place things that are working? So we do have 27 recommendations, and again, we didn't want to totally overwhelm government. In some cases we have, but we also wanted to try and break it down that we could make things manageable. And I'll just tell you a little bit about the sort of specifically the relationship with the Ministry of Education, because I think that's obviously of interest to the group here. First of all, we've actually worked very closely with them. They have been a very good partner. It was a little tricky at the beginning, but the agreement we had was they have a mandate to deliver education, which we totally agree with. That's your mandate, that's what you do. But when you go beyond that, and we now are talking about community hubs or how we use the schools differently or all of those, it's not just about education anymore. It's actually about other ministries, it's about the community, it's about all of that. So we agreed that they would remain whole. So if they're funding education, they fund the school, but there needs to be a bigger conversation if we're trying to do interesting things that other ministries or partners come into that financial conversation. So we're trying to figure out what that looks like. The other thing that is specific to education, which is now underway, is a review of Regulation 444 for a couple of areas that people highlighted. One is how you circulate the when you're looking at a surplus property. Who sees that and how do they see that? And also the period of time that, people have to actually respond to that surplus piece. I would back it up the effort that we're working on as they go through the accommodation review piece. Instead of waiting until they've done all of their homework, we're trying to figure out what's the planning process that actually should start at the same time, so that we're talking with other community partners that if you don't need the school, or if you're trying to figure out what the education component is, there's a conversation going on about what that services are needed in the community, so it's not everything at the last minute and there's a bit of a fire sale panic, which is what's been happening. The other issue we raised, and people said it many times, is a lot of the policies that we're talking about of community hubs, which is shared space or collaboration or using the school after hours. As school boards are trying to consolidate, they're actually pushing out the community use, which is what we're trying to drive in that conversation. As I said, we haven't figured all of this out, but one of the things we did also is we're working with the Ministry of Community Safety to look at the policy around schools and how we actually make our schools safe and secure, but at the same time allow for community use in a way, whether it's an appropriate use in the school, whether there's a way of building the design of the school differently. How do we actually, because those are two competing policies again. You want a safe school, everyone accepts that, but you also want to be able to invite the community into what in many places people feel is their actual community school or community center. So I would say that we want to sort of have question and answer with you and actually get your advice on sort of some of the things that we need to think about. We can try and work through some of the things that we have on our plate. Sort of chuckled when the Premier said, you have 90 days, the report's released, we now have an implementation plan, and we actually have a mandate through the advisory group from my appointment, which is till March, and I met with her and said, okay, we got 5 months left. She goes, you're going to be busy, get it done. So there is a real feeling of urgency within the government, whether we're going to not obviously tackle everything, but we're trying to move forward in a logical way that we can actually try and move the dial on some of these things that for the last couple of decades have been stuck in a process that we're trying to actually nudge and move in a different direction. So I'm sure you can appreciate there's good days and bad days on that front, but we are trying very hard to sort of change the conversation and get a much more robust conversation going about what is it that makes a vital community and how do these community hubs play a role in a local environment.
It's good. As you can see, she has a lot of work.
So I don't know whether we want questions. I know you had one right in the middle. Do you want to ask?
Yeah, this is an amazing idea.
You can talk very loudly or stand up, please. Thank you.
It's an amazing idea. Okay. My first two questions. First question is to check if it's, do you have a website in French?
Great.
And the second is, do we have an example in French also?
Oui. Oui,
Yes.
nous avons les deux. C'est ontario.ca/ les hubs communautaires en français et la consultation c'est fait aussi en français. Mais pendant les exemples, nous avons plusieurs des exemples à Ottawa et à la Nord.
And Sudbury. And we have actually
Sudbury.
been in touch with the Francophone community. I'm not going to try and pretend that I can have that conversation with you in French, but we actually, and the Minister of Francophone Affairs has been very much focused on making sure that we do not miss that component of the conversation.
Parce que c'est très important pour la communauté culturelle. Alors, dans l'autochtone et aussi à la francophone, c'est important.
Thank you.
My name is Krista. I'm with the campaign Help Fix Our Schools. Karen and I spoke briefly.
Name and face, it's always good.
I know you from Twitter.
So it's good to meet you all in person. So our concern is about the safety and maintenance of these public assets that we call schools, that they're well maintained, that they're safe, that they provide good environments for learning and for other uses that you're speaking about. So one of the, and you mentioned the term low-hanging fruit, and a year and a half ago when I got into this, we had thought in terms of funding solutions, low-hanging fruit would be revisiting education development charges and which school boards are eligible for those and what they can be used for. So I just wonder if that's part of, like that would fit into long-term, financially sustainable. And it's certainly not it's not the panacea to all of this, but it would be one more funding stream to bring into the mix that right now many school boards are not able to benefit when a new condo development is built. So there's money that could be released with a change of a provincial reg. So I'm just wondering if that's something that falls under what you're looking at, or if that's outside it.
No, it does. And actually, we generically talked about development charges to stay away from the hot button of EDC specifically. But that is very much a conversation we're trying to say yes. It's not specifically EDCs in the report. We made it a little more general because there are development charges of what education development charges are a part of. But it is very much on the discussion. Everybody gets really nervous about development charges, although the developers will say, as long as you do it the same for everyone else, we're fine. But so it is. And the one, yeah, nothing is low-hanging fruit when you talk about development charges. I'm just saying. Oh, sorry. Okay, so what happens now is there is education development charges are actually, a board can work with the municipality and someone who's going to be the expert is going to fix if I don't have this quite right. But if your school board actually is at capacity and there's development going on, you can charge development charges so the developer actually puts money into the school system. Right now in Toronto, they can't charge through the Toronto District School Board because there's surplus spaces. So the regulation does not allow the Toronto District School Board to charge EDCs, education development charges, which means that when there's an explosion in a certain part, like downtown Toronto, and it may be some capacity, extra capacity in, Scarborough or Etobicoke, it penalizes the whole system. So, and I think there's a recognition of that problem. I would say yes, so that's part of the challenge. And when people are building, so when you have a general building, the municipality charges development charges for development, and then they use it for parkland or, whatever they want. So that's what that is. There's just one other comment I would say on the Fix Our Schools piece. One of the reasons that we were actually able to convince both the government and the Premier more particularly is that we should look at this sale of properties and whether we should be doing it at fair market value was we are selling school properties, but we're actually not fixing the problem anywhere close to the deferred maintenance on our school buildings. So there's a disconnect between those two. Instead, we should be looking at what's the strategy for rebuilding our infrastructure in a way that actually takes care of that deferred maintenance. And selling properties is not cutting it. It's just not helping. Sorry, there's a... Yeah.
What you just said, that you said there's a recognition of the problem. Who's recognizing?
You mean in terms of the government?
Yeah.
Well, I would say that the Ministry of Education recognize it. Certainly within government it's recognized. I think there's so many layers within the education portfolio right now that it's just how much change and how much appetite you have for taking on new initiatives. They're doing the Regulation 444 challenge in terms of that consultation. So we actually have to be careful with what we're doing, that we don't completely overwhelm government, because then it goes into complete gridlock and nothing happens. So what we're trying to do is actually not overwhelm government and actually try and tackle some of these issues in a way. And I have to say, we're in a fine place. If we add too much more, we're going to end up getting people saying, you know what, forget it. We've got so much on our plate, and you're just adding like a huge layer. So there is a recognition that this is a challenge. It's not like number one on the list of things to do. Maybe how do we want to do this? We'll go around the room. How's that? Or do you want to?
Okay. It's up to you.
We'll go this way. Yeah.
I'm wondering where any sort of environmental sustainability fits in on this plan.
Well,
Question?
We'll repeat the question as people do it. And the question was, where does environmental sustainability fit with this plan?
So it's a good question. I mean, I think that it fits within everything that we do, and I know that there's a number of initiatives in terms of building design and all of that we're trying to figure out. But I would say in terms of some of the things we need to fix before we even talk about that are the ones we're trying to get sorted out first. But environmental is very much a part of the design criteria that we would love to see, but we're not trying to do that at a local level, I guess is the way I would describe it. But we're welcome if you have suggestions. All I've said is we've tackled a lot, but if people have thoughts about either what we've missed in 90 days or if you have suggestions about what it should include, absolutely open to that.
Mary Cruden, I'm here from Canadian Parents for French. I was one of those people that emailed Karen right away. I got a great
It's so good, names in play. Like I'm putting all these.
Yeah. Each other for a long, long time.
Yeah.
So the reason why, obviously, I think I'm part of the group. We've met the majority of the things. Community hubs are a pretty awesome opportunity for all of us. But what concerns me in education, particularly for people in this room, and I'm going to build on what Krista said. Yes, safety in our schools is important, and yes, we want our children all to have excellent facilities. I mean, just look around this building. It would be great if every public school looked like this. It would be awesome. Even the bathroom was amazing. But we haven't had a serious conversation in education about what should be in a school before we decide to partner up and share that space with the broader community. So I'm going to give the example of core French teachers. And I was at a meeting once and the core French teacher said the only person worse off in the education system than the core French teacher is the itinerant music teacher. And I said, why is that? And she said, well, core French teachers push a cart around the school, classroom. Itinerant music teachers take the TTC with their saxophone to 3 different schools in a day. So the thing is, we need to have a conversation in education about what should be in a school. There should be lunchroom facilities for junior kindergarten right through to grade 8. When my kids were in grade 7 and 8, there was no place for them to eat lunch in the school. They were told to go to Bloor Street. Okay? Robin knows what I'm talking about.
I do.
And the core French teacher pushing the cart around in a school in Oshawa where there are 3 classrooms closed because they're reducing caretaking costs. So, yeah, exactly. And so there's this whole thing about measuring capacity in schools that was decided when Mike Harris was premier that needs to align with what our current needs and aspirations are for our kids and our programming. So anyway, I know that I put that into the hopper, but I think that's a conversation that has to take place within the education community first, and whatever you can do to facilitate the ministry about having a conversation about aligning programming for kids with facilities before we get too far down the road would be awesome. So that was a speech, not a question.
Okay.
Did most people hear that?
Yeah.
The question really was that the conversation that People for Education has led well to is what should be in schools and how do we design for all the different needs. And we have to have a conversation about what should school look like. Thank you.
And we would agree, but we're not having that conversation.
I get it.
Yes, I'm coming. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm from the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of, I'm from the municipality of Northern Bruce Peninsula. And as a small citizens group, we're trying to look at the closure of rural schools, especially in single school communities, because it really affects community vitality to not have a school. So we have arranged a local, designed some pre-studies, focus group agendas and surveys for youth, for community. So we've got the community piece sort of sorted out. And we know, and we've got some funding coming for a second step where we start looking at beyond assessment, we're starting to look at designing and developing. And so my question to you would be, who needs to be at that table? Like, is it useful to have somebody from each of the ministries? Have you had some experience yet with it? Or have you thought through that in terms of, it's the moving into the larger sphere that of coordinating all of these different services that is the harder part for us. Assessment, that's a lot more straightforward.
So the question is about the mechanics of actually moving a hub and bringing it into creation. And I think what you were earlier, Karen, was at one point I brought a list of about 40 different activities that have to occur if a hub is going to be birthed. So this is the question: is how do we do this?
I read your report.
Yeah, good for you. It's not a hard read, is it? No. Okay, there you go.
Thank you.
Watching for it. I talked to you before it came out.
And we will make a nod to Doug Raycraft and others. A lot of the wisdom, and People for Education has always stood for this as well, is that in towns where the school is the hub, where it's the center, and if you close the school, the town dies. This is one of the compelling reasons. We see it in urban areas as well because of need, but we also see it in small towns.
I think the challenge, so your challenge proposition about how do we get that planning piece done, we're actually working with municipal affairs and actually trying to figure out how to actually provide a bit of a guideline and a map to sort of how to do that. And, that's one of the big challenges we know right off the top. So, we'd like to understand sort of where you are and keep in touch. That's what I've said. The only other thing I would say, which I can't believe I'm going to say this, is the Premier wanted to have pilot projects as part of this report, and the advisory committee said absolutely don't agree because we've engaged the province in this conversation, and if we go pick a pilot project, it's easy to show success in one or two pilot projects, but it doesn't actually change the world in which we're trying to work. So we didn't, and as a result, we've had now like up to 40 pilot projects where people have said, but this is the problem we're trying to tackle and we're trying to work towards that. So we are trying to follow the process so that we can help map it to say, like as you're going through this process, we need to understand what the challenges are so we can try and work with you. So we'll keep in touch.
And it's also going to build the resource center so that people can share learnings across different sites.
Yeah, and we have experts that are happy to help with their experience too. Sorry, we're...
And follow up something that you said earlier. I'm a perfect example of living directly across from what was a beautiful school. Flatland, they want to put 136 townhouses. We had more election signs saying no to townhouses than any politician would ever put up. 423 people showed up at the development proposal meeting. But to make a long story short, school gone, area review committees are still going on, and a mile up the street, I should say about a kilometer and change up the street, there's 4 huge high-rises going to be placed in there. Now again, where are all those kids going to go to?
Where is that? Where?
Briar Hill and Dufferin. And the 4 high-rises are Lawrence and Dufferin. 4 huge high-rises.
Well, they're probably all one bedroom, so no kids can live there.
So, are you going to have a 6-story school or an 8-story school or whatever?
So it's
Where do you play football and where do you whatever?
So we hear you. We're not. I mean, we're trying to actually take a pause and figure out what that looks like. Some of them are, we're not going to be able to catch up to, but that is why we're doing
This
this.
is going on all over
I
the
know.
place.
I know.
No disrespect in the country. There's a little bit of flatland left, but I don't think there's much in Toronto.
No, and we hear you loud and clear. So I'm not going to say we're going to be able to fix it all, but that's why this is so important at this time. To the back up there. So making my way across. Go ahead.
My name is Jennifer Story. I'm school board trustee for Toronto Danforth for the Toronto District School Board. My question is about the financing piece. And I've been to a number of these discussions and I've heard you speak very eloquently about this topic. I commend the committee for the advisory group for its work. A lot of sidebar conversations also happen. And in some of those, I've heard a number of mentions of Infrastructure Ontario and their potential involvement in financing some of these hubs. For those who might not know Infrastructure Ontario, one of their mandates is to basically promote and execute, manage the development of infrastructure in part through public-private partnerships. And full disclosure, not a fan of P3 development, concerned about what that might look like. So I'm curious to know to what extent IO's involvement is on the table and where that might lead.
So I don't know where those conversations are coming from because that conversation, to the best of my knowledge, has not happened at all. IO has a number of different roles within. I mean, P3 is, or public-private partnerships, is just one component of what they do. They also manage the real estate, which is just like for the government, which is a different role. They also provide capacity in terms of procurement advice and some of the skills that maybe in a capacity point of view. But I can tell you that, I mean, there may be conversations that I don't know about, but there certainly has been no conversation about IO playing a role in public-private partnerships around community hubs or schools.
The one place I've heard it is through the Ontario Nonprofit Network has always been talking with Infrastructure Ontario about loans and expanding the criteria of what nonprofits might be able to access those capital reserves. So
that's true.
The one place I've heard it.
And one of the things we did actually include in a recommendation was to review the IO loan programs, so that right now if you're a not-for-profit and you want to borrow money from IO at less than market rates, it's just about impossible to do it. So we've said, well, you're kind of great, you've got this program, but nobody actually can access it. That is on the table. So you're right, in terms of there are conversations around that, but not the other. Yes?
Sort of following on that, the name of this section, and I certainly understand the perspective with some of the surplus space that you find in the education sector, but it's always schools as community hubs, not just community hubs. So I would inquire, you're talking about changing the disposition regs for school boards, 44498, but when it comes to Infrastructure Ontario, school boards do not have access to IA's website about surplus property. School boards do not have access to any other public space, first dibs. School boards don't have any of the advantages that the very focus of this report drills down to. Why isn't it just community hubs?
So, well, to be fair, it is. We're having this conversation about schools, but that exact problem is what we're working with at IO to change.
I'm not hearing anything.
Okay, well, but there's a lot of there's a lot of pieces that have to happen behind the scenes too, but that issue is absolutely, in terms of being able to view the property, I talked about that at the beginning, that's hard, is exactly for that reason, because there's no...
We've just gotten the ability as a school board to view.
Right.
We have no ability to put properties on.
No, and trust me, it is top of mind. And when you say you haven't seen it, it's because we have to fix this internal to government so that actually we can do this. And that is one of the conversations that I have to tell you is happening now, and it's very much. And if there's things you want to see in that, you let me know, because we are working on that to open that up.
If I can just add, I think we have 20 minutes left, so we'll get there.
Oh, I'm moving.
All right,
Everybody-
try and be nice, people. I don't think people want to talk. We're trying to co-facilitate. I just wanted to add the final point, though, is that it's a very short timeline in which this work is happening, and actually the bulk of the work is happening within government. Government has to change, and I say that as somebody who works as a nonprofit.
Yeah, I'm a trustee with the school board. We are declining the school board, and so we have closed many schools. We have been able to use the proceeds of that to fix up our other schools in the inner city of where I live. What we were actually able to do was close 4 very overtired buildings that were all half empty and build 2 brand new facilities that were much larger and offered all the programming for the students. So we do reinvest. Not all school boards operate the same. I know that many organizations and union members are hoping to keep schools open with school hubs, but what always has to be kept in the back of mind too is when school boards look at closing schools, one of the big things we look at is the ability to provide full programming for the students. So if you only have 80, 100 students in a school, it's very, very difficult to provide programming, and we absolutely must ensure that every child receives every opportunity for their programming. So there's a lot of pushes and everything on it. And we have, when we built these schools, we actually hired a facility to come in so that we could look at what partnerships.
Okay, I'm going to ask you because I think
What's
there's
the
a lot of
question?
people that,
Yeah.
is there a question? Because we,
No, just
okay.
a statement.
Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off,
Yeah.
but I know that there's quite a large appetite for, we'll take one over here and then
So-
we'll go over there just to.
So the statement was, just because
Yeah.
I made that commitment for those who might not be able to hear as well, the statement was that there's a lot of things to balance when you're a school trustee about being able to offer, for instance, a full program to has a small enrollment. There's a lot of different push and pulls.
To the top.
Also a school board trustee for Waterloo Region. And I guess the question is disposition of the schools, and it's finance, excuse me, to a point, but right now the disposition of the sale goes back into buildings, building repairing, and I'm kind of hearing, and again mishearing, but that the schools don't belong to the school boards or the community, that they're going to be, because we're offering them to the municipality, we're offering them. What's going to happen in terms of the finances for the school board? That's very selfish, but it's...
Well, we're not, like I said, we're not trying to solve all the world's problems. Sometimes it feels like it. So we're not talking about changing the finances of the school board. What we have said, where it makes sense, we might actually try to help the school board where there's providing community, benefits or whatever that doesn't actually all have to be funded out of the Ministry of Education's envelope. So I don't think there's any conversation about changing the dynamic between the school board's funding envelope, that this is now somebody else's. So that's not part of the discussion.
Just the confusion is, it sounds, even in your report, I've read your report, it does sound like we're going to have to offer it to more people for the dollar, which does, we have closed some schools and it brings money back into our board. And so it's not that it's community hubs, but education doesn't have a lot of funding.
I think the tension is, and I'll again say this as a community service provider, that community views schools as just part of the community assets, of part of the wealth that's available within locally. And schools actually are available in every neighborhood across Toronto compared to many other sorts of levels of services. So people feel a sense of ownership about schools. So that's part of probably some of the tension you might see reflected in the report that talks about that. But there was also at the same time a commitment made that school boards will be kept whole, will not suffer for this moving the vision forward of opening the doors of schools. I don't know if that's fair.
Yeah.
I appreciate the question about the ownership, because I had a similar question to that. I taught for 10 years at the Toronto District School Board. I'm active in the Elementary Teachers of Toronto. And I chose to become a teacher in 97 when I saw my teachers standing up against my parents. I remember that transition from school boards that could raise taxes locally to school boards that depend on the province for funding. That was a whole layer of democracy, and it ties it to hubs, because at that point it was very clear those schools were owned by the local people. You could access a decision maker who could shape the infrastructure very directly. And now that funding comes from the province, which has an impact on our local democracy. And so when I look at this and I'm hearing about some of the barriers, I mean, I look at this and I think, okay, well, one way to integrate all this is you get rid of, all the, get rid of the school boards and everything becomes individually owned, and then everything becomes integrated. And I hear a short timeline. I think Barbara Hall report, and I also hear, every now and then I'll read the paper, discussion. Do we need school boards? And I wonder who will own this, because in a culture of fear, and I agree with what was said about fear. I don't know other school boards were like, but school board, we're democratically elected trustees. We don't have power to make a lot of decisions. It can be a culture of fear. And in fact, when you go into democracy, you live in a culture of fear. And public ownership is essential to democracy, because if the public doesn't own things, well, you can't really shape many decisions because it's not yours to own. So to tie this in, I want to know what is at the end of the short timeline, why the short timeline, and please outline what, in more detail, the reviews or the questions that are being asked and what changes are being discussed around this. I forget the name of the regulation.
For the regulation?
Please outline that in a little more detail.
So I'm going to jump in again. And I've known Karen for probably close to a decade because of her work in trying to keep school pools open in the east end of the city and across the city. And across the city. But I'm an East Ender. And the conversation also arose out of some work with a couple of other women who were strong parent activists, and again out of the Harris days. So I recognize that there are tensions. It's scary. This is it. But it's also what stopped us and why my kids are now 20 and 24 and haven't had that. Although the school that they went to was built to be a community hub. It had a public-facing library, but we just never opened those doors. And so I think what I'm going to ask is that we put some of that fear aside and just have some faith that of good intent, what some of the problems are here are the number of silos. I had a very funny conversation as we were starting this work, because they said, well, just to give us an understanding of the different things that you're competing, the mechanics of what gets in the way, we had to describe the number of funding relationships that our one nonprofit had with the provincial government. And we had like 17 different versions and contracts and stuff. So there's sometimes, there's the broader culture of whether people will welcome this. And I think Karen's an articulate spokesperson of why. And I think most of us believe that hubs are a good thing. But there's also a layer that we're trying to address here in the short term that's around the mechanics of what regulations are getting in the way. And I know this is People for Education. I spent 10 years here as doing the research number crunching, that things like funding formula and other things are really big things, unspoken, that get in the way of this. But I think that this is a small insertion point where we can make a difference, and let's try to in the short time. Short timeline is because we know this is a good idea. Let's have an appetite for action. Let's have these conversations. Let's get government at the table figuring it out.
So I'm just going to, because I do actually have some sympathy. So I could have been the special advisor to the Minister of Education, but we acknowledge that actually the Ministry of Education can't solve all of these problems. And while this is, so I am the special advisor to the Premier because it is a whole of government approach, which makes people nervous when you say, okay, so how's that going to work with the Ministry of Education? We actually, in the conversations we had across the province, I have to say schools came up a lot, but going to the point, this is just about, it is about schools in this room, but I have to tell you, I've been to many rooms where schools actually don't even come up, if you can believe it, as part of the conversation around community hubs. There are great examples of community hubs in schools currently today. And we, Durham, they keep sending me more and more things. There's lots of places where community hubs are real and vital, and people recognize that it's part of the learning experience. So we're not trying to change the world. We're not trying to say the school boards don't have a role. We're not trying to sort of change the entire funding formula, although some people thought we should. We're not talking about property ownership. We're trying to incrementally nudge people to actually say there's an opportunity here for which education has been holding the burden of trying to do everything on the backs of education, when there's an interest in a large part of the community in participating. I have to tell you, seniors are on my case all the time. We paid for these schools, and I can't even get in the door. So there's a tension in the system, which we recognize, but we're not talking about, sort of changing the entire world. We're just trying to actually change some of the conversations or have the conversation about what should this look like for our entire community. I'm going to go on this side just because we haven't.
We have 6 minutes left.
Okay.
My name is Robin Kilkey, and I'm the current chair of the Toronto District School Board. So we've actually spoken on the phone as well, so another page.
Life now.
I do have a bit of, I'm not against community hubs. I think it is a terrific idea, but I do have some concerns that when I listen to you describe what the process is going on now, the only part that the Ministry of Education seems to be in is this about Regulation 444. And the fact is, for many people in this room, the ministry has other policies that are very detrimental to us making faculty. That was an early step. Move forward in many areas. So I feel concerned that if the only area, that's a barrier for us in many ways. And I'm concerned that if that's the only area, I understand what you're saying is you're not a funding source on stuff, but fixing the regulation is not going to help getting schools into the hopper.
So that's it.
My concern.
No, but actually, and
I
I
also didn't understand what the Ministry of Community Safety is doing because I thought that was skills.
No, community safety actually is incredibly interesting because they're actually trying to deal with community safety as part of a bigger conversation around how do we actually make our community safe. And, we just thought in some ways we're trying to actually help the Ministry of Education. But I want to throw, usually what we do at these sessions is we know we didn't capture all of the barriers. We know that there's things, if the education sector said these are things that actually are a huge problem, so we can't see the database, we've got problems with this, tell us, because it's not to say that we can fix it, but if we actually don't know it's a problem, I guarantee you we can't fix it. So I would say if there's things that you think that actually we should know and that we should put on our list, we need to hear that as part of the conversation, and we are more than happy to do what we can to keep the conversation going. And to be honest, it really helps to say the community said this. It's not, I actually have been a filter in some ways, and I actually like to bring and have people either from Cabinet Office or the Ministry of Education as part of this, because it's not just me making this up. It's people have said this is a really irritating problem, but if you don't tell us or put in, that's why the submissions frankly gave huge weight to the report, is that it was like, wow, everybody is saying exactly the same thing. So I welcome that, if these are the challenges that we're trying to tackle now, what are the other issues that actually would make life a lot easier as a school board in terms of how we do that? So more than happy to have that. Yes.
I have to add, though, to detail person.
Okay, sorry.
Around 444, though, that actually what the ministry said is the ministry accepts the recommendation, will be consulting on amendments to Regulation 444 as other potential changes to the regulation. But the preceding paragraph talked about how actually they recognize that there is a range of issues they have to deal with. This was their first step out on dealing with community hubs. So it's not that they don't recognize that there's more. And they posted it to their website. It is the response to the Community Hub report. It's there signed. Okay.
How does health promoting schools and the initiative that's going on in the schools sort of mesh with this community hub issue? Have you looked at that as a...
Well, I guess there's a couple of things. Not every school should be a community hub, and not every community needs a community hub. So in some ways it may be 20% of what we're talking about, and yet it's captured a whole bunch of interest. There are community hubs, so healthy schools, and a lot of the work that's going on in that actually recognize that if there's things in the school that make it better, they could call themselves a community hub. So again, that's why we've been very careful not to be prescriptive in terms of defining things or saying you should have one, because this is not an everywhere kind of approach, and this is also within a school environment. You say, what do we need for our community may be very different in one community. So I think the Healthy Schools Initiative is something that mirrors quite nicely with the kind of approach that we're talking about.
So I guess this is my final question, and then we can do comments.
Right in the middle.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, my question is basically, I'm looking at all the action items. A lot of them are overlapping. And it is very challenging. I think it's a challenge for the people in this room, and it's overwhelming for the people in this room. And you mentioned that if it's overwhelming for government, it could shut down. So my question is, what can we do when we leave this room today to make sure that that does not shut down?
That's it. So thank you.
Nice question.
That's a great question. And I mean, that is part of the, having as an organization some things that you feel strongly about as a collective would be very helpful, because as we try and prioritize sort of, the 27 action items, we know that we're going to be able to move the dial on some. We're going to move the dial on all, but we're going to actually put a lot of effort into some. And it would be helpful from the education sector. So when I talk about the education sector, there's the school board trustees, the Association of School Boards for Catholic and French and Public, there's the directors, there's the principals. So it's really hard, as trying to get a position from the education sector, you can only appreciate. So there are specific recommendations that if you said, these are really important to us, then that would be very helpful. And if you have suggestions about how to move that forward, that would be really helpful. Because I agree, we have a lot on our plate, and we have tried to prioritize some that we think are going to make a difference, but it would be really helpful to know that from you. In the middle.
Hi, my name is Chris Penrose. I'm with an organization called Success Beyond Limits. We operate a youth space inside of a high school, so Western Centennial, Western High School in the community. Our submission was around looking at the City of Toronto's youth lounge model that was based on the research around St. Stephen's House, and looking at bringing youth spaces into schools as a part of integrated service delivery in schools as hubs. One of the challenges that we see to that is how we understand if a school is full or not. So when Margaret Wilson was on the radio talking about revenue generation in full schools, there are revenue generating sources, such as daycares or adult school, that still count as being empty space in the school. And for us, we'll have about 200 young people in a day come through the space. But from the ministry lens, that's an empty room. So I'm just wondering and suggesting or recommending, or love to hear feedback on opening the conversation on where how we understand if a school is full or not, because I think that conversation about the development charges is connected to that as well. These being considered more empty than it really is. And the last part of it, related to that, is just how do we also ensure that nothing that's revenue generating is considered empty?
Okay, so to be honest, that's another great question. We could go on probably all day. So one of the recommendations we have is to actually look at a community utilization rate. Now, we just said look at it and try and figure out, so to tackle that exact problem. The ministry says this is what it is. So one of the recommendations, we haven't said, now we know what a community utilization rate looks like. We haven't sort of said, okay, now what do we do with it, because we don't know. But we recognize that the way that the Ministry of Education looks at space completely ignores the fact that the space that you're talking about. So that is one of the recommendations, and actually the City of Toronto is trying to figure that out because they have a real interest in that. And then to your point, the other point about, if I look at an MLS system for real estate, and they have, space for lease, space for sale, and why can't we actually have an MLS listing for where you have capacity? And I've talked to a couple of the school boards that would desperately love to know that, for people to know that space is available as an opportunity that they can then evaluate. So that's what we're trying to get through. Going back to your point about how do we actually open that up? It should be really easy, and it's not. So that would be helpful in terms of, if you think that's a priority in terms of figuring out, that would actually really help us to keep this at the top of the list. And I totally agree with you. It's there, but we need help pushing. Nobody quiet. We need help pushing some of these things forward in terms of how we prioritize things. So if you come back with a position that says this is really important for us to figure out, we'll work with you to figure it out.
So I guess it's time now, so we can do conclude. I just had a concluding thought, and I'm sure you might as well. But I actually want to. One of the things that heartens me over these long decades of fighting for good things in our communities is the Martin Luther quote about how the arc of justice is long, but it bends towards good, something along those versions. And so, although we talk about a March deadline, actually, none of us are going to let it drop after that. It's still part of the mandate letters of ministries. They still have to be able to respond to this. There's still a commitment from government to have the Secretariat that continues to work on this, and all of us in our positions in community and nonprofits in schools will be continuing to talk about these things. So I hope that we can go forward in constructive manners around this.
Yeah, and I just want to say agreed and thank you all, because this is the help that we need to continue to make sure we're going in the right direction. And the only thing I would say about March or deadlines, or we're moving too fast, is if you've ever worked with government, if you don't have a deadline, you never get anything done. So we put a 90-day deadline. Now we've said March, so we'll see where we go. But I think you should take comfort that we're not going to, ram things through just because we have March. But if we don't say March, it'll be March 2020, and we'll still be having the same conversation. So that's.
Karen's going. I'll be hanging around for the day if you need to bend my ear. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.